And now here's Doc Severinsen and the NBC Orchestra, the best in the business. Give them a hand, folks. Burt Reynolds, everybody. Johnny, great to be here. You look terrific.
There are moments in television history that happen so quickly, most people watching don't even realize what they've witnessed. This was one of them. It was 1987, and Burt Reynolds was sitting across from Johnny Carson for what seemed like the 100th time. But something was different that night. The Tonight Show had a rhythm that millions of Americans knew by heart. The curtain would part. Ed McMahon would announce the guest. The band would play. And Johnny Carson would welcome another celebrity into the most famous chair in television. For Burt Reynolds, that chair was practically a second home. He'd sat there more than any other actor in the show's history. More than Frank Sinatra. More than Bob Hope. More than anyone. Over 100 appearances spanning nearly 2 decades. And every single time, the formula worked. Burt would swagger out with that $1,000,000 smile. He'd toss off a self-deprecating joke about his latest movie. Johnny would lean back and laugh in that way only he could. Genuine, warm, inviting. The audience would fall in love all over again. It was comfort television at its finest. But on this particular night in October of 1987, something in the air felt different. The show opened as it always did. Johnny delivered his monologue. The audience laughed in all the right places. Doc Severinsen's band played through the commercial breaks with their usual polish. Everything appeared normal. And then Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, Burt Reynolds. The audience erupted. They always did for Burt. He was at the absolute peak of his fame in 1987, the biggest movie star in the world, box office gold, the kind of celebrity who could sell out theaters just by showing his face on a poster. He walked through the curtain wearing a dark blazer and that trademark grin. Johnny stood to greet him. They shook hands. The audience kept cheering. Burt sat down. The applause faded. And Johnny opened with his usual warmth. Always good to see you. Good to be here, Johnny. The first 15 minutes of the interview followed the expected pattern. They talked about Burt's newest film. They laughed about stories from the set. Burt told an anecdote about a stunt that went wrong. Johnny played the perfect straight man, feeding him setups, letting Burt be Burt. The audience was eating it up, but then something shifted. It happened so subtly that most viewers at home probably didn't notice. Burt's smile faded, just for a second. His eyes changed, and when Johnny asked him about his next project, Burt paused longer than usual before answering. "You know, Johnny," Burt said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot lately about what comes next." The audience laughed. They thought it was another setup for a joke, but Johnny didn't laugh. He tilted his head slightly. His expression changed. Anyone who'd watched The Tonight Show for years knew that look. It was the look Johnny got when he sensed something real happening beneath the surface of celebrity small talk. "What do you mean?" Johnny asked. Burt leaned forward. His voice dropped. "I mean really thinking about it." The studio audience grew quieter. "Well," Johnny said carefully, "you've got plenty of good years ahead of you." Burt smiled, but it wasn't his usual smile. It was something else, something sadder. "That's the thing, Johnny. I'm not so sure anymore." What the audience didn't know, what almost nobody knew at that time, was that Burt Reynolds was struggling. Not financially, not professionally. He was still the biggest star in Hollywood, but personally, privately, Burt was falling apart. His marriage to Lonnie Anderson was crumbling. The press was starting to circle, smelling blood in the water. Tabloids were publishing rumors. Photographers were camped outside his house. The public divorce battle that would consume the next several years was just beginning. But that wasn't all. Burt had recently been diagnosed with a serious jaw condition called temporomandibular joint dysfunction, TMJ. The pain was constant and excruciating. He'd lost significant weight. He wasn't sleeping, and he'd started taking medication to manage the pain, medication that was slowly starting to take control of his life. None of this was public knowledge yet. To America, Burt Reynolds was still the invincible movie star, the charming rogue, the guy who always had a joke and a smile. But sitting across from Johnny Carson that night, something in Burt was breaking. Johnny leaned back in his chair. He'd known Burt for nearly 20 years. They'd spent hundreds of hours together on that stage. They'd shared stories off camera that the public would never hear. They'd become friends in the way that only two people who understand the strange isolation of fame can become friends. And Johnny knew when something was wrong. "Burt," Johnny said softly, "are you okay?" The audience went completely silent. Burt looked down at his hands. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he looked up at Johnny. "Can I tell you something?" Burt asked. "Of course." "Off the record?" And that's when it happened. Johnny Carson did something he had never done in 25 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Cut to commercial." The director in the booth froze. The band stopped playing. Ed McMahon's mouth fell open. In the entire history of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had never, not once, called for a commercial break himself. That wasn't how it worked. The producers controlled the commercial breaks. The director controlled the cameras. Johnny controlled the conversation, but he never controlled the broadcast. It was an unspoken rule of live television. The host doesn't call the shots. The host performs. But Johnny Carson had just broken his own rule. The director quickly cut to commercial. The red lights on the cameras went dark, and suddenly Johnny and Burt were alone on that stage, as alone as two people can be in a room filled with 300 audience members and a full production crew. Johnny stood up from his desk. He walked around to where Burt was sitting, and he pulled up a chair next to him. What happened during those next 4 minutes would never be broadcast. The cameras weren't rolling. The microphones were off. The commercial break gave them a small window of privacy in the middle of the most public forum in America. But people who were there that night, crew members, audience members, the band, they remember what they saw. Burt Reynolds, the biggest movie star in the world, broke down. He put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook. Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, put his hand on Burt's shoulder and leaned in close. He didn't say much. He just listened. Burt talked. The words came pouring out. The pain he was in, the marriage falling apart, the fear that his career was about to collapse, the medication he'd started taking, the feeling that everything he'd built was slipping through his fingers. And Johnny just sat there with him. The audience didn't make a sound. The band members looked away, trying to give them privacy, even though privacy was impossible. Ed McMahon stood off to the side, his usual jovial expression replaced with something else. Concern, sadness, respect for what he was witnessing. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3. The director was getting signals from the network. The commercial break was running long. They needed to come back. Affiliates were waiting. Schedules had to be maintained. But Johnny didn't move. He stayed right there next to Burt until Burt was ready. Finally, after nearly 4 minutes, an eternity in television time, Burt lifted his head. He wiped his eyes. He took a deep breath. Johnny looked at him. "You good?" Johnny asked quietly. Burt nodded. "You sure?" "Yeah," Burt said. "Yeah, I'm good." Johnny stood up. He walked back to his desk. He straightened his tie. He looked at the director and gave a small nod. The red lights on the cameras came back on. They were live again. Johnny looked into the camera with that same calm, professional expression he'd worn for 25 years. "We're back," he said simply. He turned to Burt. The audience didn't know what to do. They'd just witnessed something extraordinary, but they didn't fully understand what they'd seen. Some people started to applaud tentatively. Others stayed quiet. Burt Reynolds sat in his chair, his eyes still red, his composure barely holding. And then Johnny Carson did something else he almost never did. He changed the subject completely. He didn't ask Burt to explain what had just happened. He didn't press him for details. He didn't try to turn a private moment into public entertainment. Instead, Johnny started telling a story. It was a story about the first time Burt had appeared on The Tonight Show back in 1970. A funny story about Burt showing up 3 hours early because he was so nervous. A story about how they'd sat in Johnny's dressing room and talked about football and old movies and everything except the interview Burt was terrified to do. Burt started to smile. Then he started to laugh. And slowly, carefully, Johnny guided the conversation back to safe ground. They talked about nothing important for the next 10 minutes. Old stories, shared memories, inside jokes that only people who'd known each other for 2 decades could share. The audience relaxed. The tension lifted. By the time the segment ended, you would never have known that anything unusual had happened. Burt stood up. He shook Johnny's hand. He waved to the audience. He walked back through the curtain. And Johnny Carson moved on to the next segment as if it were just another night. But it wasn't just another night. What happened during those 4 minutes of dead air, that unrehearsed, unscripted moment of human compassion, became legend among the people who worked on The Tonight Show. The crew members talked about it for years afterward. The way Johnny had simply stopped the show. The way he'd walked away from his desk, from his role, from everything that made The Tonight Show what it was, just to sit with a friend who was hurting. It violated every rule of television production. It cost the network money. It confused affiliates. It threw off the entire rhythm of the broadcast. But Johnny Carson didn't care, because in that moment, Burt Reynolds wasn't a celebrity and Johnny Carson wasn't a host. They were just two people who'd known each other a long time, and one of them needed help. The promise Johnny had made to Burt years earlier was never spoken out loud. It wasn't something they'd discussed or formalized or agreed upon in any official way, but it was real nonetheless. The promise was simply this: when you sit in that chair, you're safe. Johnny Carson had built The Tonight Show on a foundation of trust. Every celebrity who walked through that curtain knew that Johnny would make them look good. He would set them up for success. He would protect them. But the promise went deeper than that. It meant that if something went wrong, if the interview went off the rails, if a joke fell flat, if a personal crisis bubbled to the surface, Johnny would handle it. He wouldn't exploit it. He wouldn't sensationalize it. He wouldn't turn someone's pain into entertainment. He would protect them. Burt Reynolds had sat in that chair more than 100 times. He'd trusted Johnny for nearly 20 years. And when he finally reached a breaking point, when the pressure and the pain and the fear became too much to carry alone, he knew exactly where to go. He went to Johnny, and Johnny kept his promise. In the days and weeks that followed that October night in 1987, almost nothing was written about what had happened. A few television critics noted that The Tonight Show had experienced an unusually long commercial break. One or two mentioned that Burt Reynolds had seemed emotional during his appearance. But nobody really understood what they'd witnessed. The footage of those 4 minutes doesn't exist in any archive. The cameras were off. No recording was made. It's simply gone. A moment in television history that happened and then vanished. The only evidence that it occurred at all exists in the memories of the people who were there, and in the way that Burt Reynolds talked about Johnny Carson for the rest of his life. In interviews years later, long after The Tonight Show had ended, long after Johnny had retired to Malibu and stepped away from the spotlight completely, Burt would occasionally be asked about his friendship with Johnny Carson. He would always get quiet. "Johnny saved my life," Burt said once in an interview in the late 1990s. The interviewer laughed, thinking it was hyperbole. Classic Burt Reynolds exaggeration. But Burt didn't laugh. "I'm serious," he said. "There was a night I was in a bad place. Really bad. And Johnny stopped everything. Just stopped the whole show. And he sat with me." "What did he say?" the interviewer asked. Burt shook his head. "That's between me and Johnny." The thing about Johnny Carson that people often forget is that he was deeply, almost pathologically private. He didn't give interviews about his personal life. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't go on talk shows to discuss his feelings or his relationships or his inner world. When he retired in 1992, he meant it. He disappeared from public life almost completely. And he never talked about that night with Burt Reynolds. Not to the press. Not in any interview. Not even in private conversations that later became public. Whatever happened during those 4 minutes stayed between the two of them. That was the promise. Burt Reynolds struggled for years after that night in 1987. The divorce from Lonnie Anderson became one of the most bitter and public celebrity breakups of the decade. His health problems worsened. His career hit rough patches. There were financial troubles and personal setbacks and all the messy complications that come with being human. But he survived. He kept working. He kept showing up. He rebuilt his career in the 1990s with Boogie Nights, earning some of the best reviews of his life. He found love again. He made peace with his past. And whenever anyone asked him about the low points, about the times when it all seemed like too much, he would mention that night on The Tonight Show. The night Johnny Carson stopped everything just to be there for him. Johnny Carson died in 2005. The tributes poured in from all over the world. Presidents and comedians and actors and musicians all shared their memories of the man who had defined late-night television for 3 decades. Burt Reynolds released a statement. It was short, just a few sentences. "Johnny was my friend. He was there for me when I needed him most. I will miss him every day for the rest of my life." Simple, direct, from the heart. Exactly the way Johnny would have wanted it. When people talk about The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson now, they usually focus on the big moments, the anniversary specials, the legendary guests, the comedy sketches that became part of American culture. They talk about Johnny's timing, his wit, his ability to make anyone feel comfortable. But the real genius of Johnny Carson wasn't just his talent as a performer. It was his understanding that sometimes the show didn't matter. Sometimes the ratings didn't matter. Sometimes the schedule and the network and the commercial breaks didn't matter. Sometimes the only thing that mattered was being there for another human being. That moment in 1987 lasted less than 5 minutes. Most people watching at home didn't understand what was happening. Many probably forgot about it entirely by the next morning. But for Burt Reynolds, those 4 minutes changed everything. They reminded him that even in Hollywood, even in the middle of fame and pressure and public scrutiny, genuine friendship was still possible. They reminded him that he wasn't alone, and they gave him the strength to keep going. Television is strange. It's designed to be disposable. Episodes air and then they're gone, replaced by the next night's show, the next week's programming, the next season's lineup. Very little of it lasts. But sometimes, rarely but sometimes, a moment happens that transcends the medium. A moment that isn't about entertainment or ratings or commerce. A moment that's just about 2 people being real with each other in front of millions of witnesses who don't quite understand what they're seeing. That's what happened on The Tonight Show in October of 1987. Burt Reynolds asked for help, and Johnny Carson stopped the world to give it to him. The commercial break that night ran for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Longer than any commercial break in the history of The Tonight Show. Long enough for a friend to tell another friend that he was drowning. And long enough for that friend to say, "I see you. I'm here. You're not alone." There's no footage of those 4 minutes, no recording, no transcript, no official record that it ever happened. Just memories. And the knowledge that on one October night in 1987, Johnny Carson broke every rule of television because he understood something that transcended entertainment. He understood that some promises matter more than the show. After that night, Burt Reynolds appeared on The Tonight Show dozens more times. Every appearance was warm, easy, filled with laughter. But people who watched closely noticed something. The way Burt looked at Johnny was different. There was gratitude there, and respect, and something deeper than the casual friendship of 2 celebrities who happened to cross paths in the same industry. It was the look of someone who had been seen at his lowest moment and not judged. Someone who had been helped without being exploited. Someone who had been given grace when he needed it most. Johnny Carson once said in a rare interview that the hardest part of hosting The Tonight Show wasn't the comedy or the timing or managing difficult guests. It was knowing when to stop being the host and start being a person. Most nights, he explained, the job was to entertain, to keep things light, to make America laugh before they went to bed. But some nights required something different. Some nights required the courage to step out of the role and just be present for someone who was hurting. Those nights, Johnny said, were the ones that mattered most. If you were watching The Tonight Show on that October night in 1987, you probably don't remember it. You probably remember other Burt Reynolds appearances, the funny ones, the ones where he told outrageous stories or flirted with the audience or made Johnny laugh so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. Those are the moments that made it into the highlight reels. But the moment that mattered most, the moment that revealed who Johnny Carson really was, is the one that disappeared. 4 minutes of dead air. 4 minutes of a friend helping a friend. 4 minutes that saved a man's life. In the years since Johnny Carson's death, many people have tried to explain what made him special. They talk about his timing, his professionalism, his ability to elevate every guest who sat across from him. All of that is true. But the real answer is simpler. Johnny Carson understood that television was just television, and people were people. And when you had to choose between the two, you chose people. Every time. Burt Reynolds died in 2018. He was 82 years old. In his final interview, recorded just weeks before his death, he was asked what moment in his career he was most proud of. He didn't mention Smokey and the Bandit. He didn't mention Deliverance or Boogie Nights or any of the films that made him famous. He talked about the people who had been there for him when everything fell apart. And he mentioned Johnny Carson. "Johnny gave me something I didn't know I needed," Burt said quietly. "He gave me permission to not be okay." He paused. That night on his show, he just stopped everything and sat with me. And he didn't need me to explain. He didn't need me to be funny or charming or entertaining. He just needed me to be honest. And then he protected that honesty. He kept it private. He didn't exploit it. Burt's voice broke slightly. That's what real friendship looks like. The promise Johnny Carson made to Burt Reynolds, the promise to protect him, to be there for him, to choose friendship over spectacle, was a promise he kept until the very end. He never talked about that night publicly. He never used it for publicity or ratings or to burnish his own legacy. He simply did what a friend does. He showed up, he listened, he helped, and then he let it go. There are thousands of hours of Tonight Show footage preserved in archives, decades of interviews and comedy sketches and musical performances. But the 4 minutes that mattered most don't exist anywhere except in memory. 4 minutes when the biggest talk show in America went silent so that two friends could be human together. 4 minutes when Johnny Carson proved that some things are more important than television. 4 minutes that nobody watching fully understood, but Burt Reynolds understood, and he never forgot. If you remember watching Johnny Carson during those years, if you remember staying up late to see who would walk through that curtain, if you remember the way he made every guest feel welcomed and safe, we'd love to hear your memories in the comments below. Tell us about your favorite Tonight Show moment. Tell us where you used to watch. Tell us what Johnny Carson meant to you. Because stories like these, stories about kindness and friendship and choosing people over performance, deserve to be remembered, even if the cameras weren't rolling.